Royalty demands the highest of standards, the finest dwellings, the greatest art collections, the grandest armies, and the most spectacular of burials. Well, that's when all things go to plan. Across the history of monarchs and succession, not all regions have been given the rightful respect of being laid to rest. Many of history's most famed figures have faced total indignation in the passing of their mortal coil. Some had their graves disturbed, some were confined to banishment long before death, and some had their dying wish denied. At their best, one could be honored in the eyes of God. At their worst, one could be turned into a ghastly tourist attraction. Welcome to History on Fleek. Today we look at the 5 worst royal burials in history. Long before her burial as the last of Henry VIII's 6 wives, Catherine Parr had the rare opportunity of actually walking away from the marriage. It may have helped that she outlived Henry VIII by around a year and a half. Their union only lasted from July 12, 1543 until the king's passing 3.5 years later. But Parr is remembered in history as an influential and stabilizing figure in the House of Tudor. Her relationships with Henry's 3 children were close and warm, and she had a huge hand in assuring their education and succession to the throne. Catherine Parr was the first woman to publish her own works in England, All Meditations on Faith. She even drew ire for exploring the sectarian divides within the country, and in 1546, a warrant for her arrest was out. But you know, having a king for a husband can kinda take care of these things. Unfortunately for Catherine Parr, her loyalty to the crown and its successors was not paid forward after her death. Following Henry's passing, Catherine would marry again, this time to Thomas Seymour, though their union would be cut short. Childbirth complications would cost her life on 5th of September 1548, and her funeral would be the first Protestant funeral service to be conducted in English in the British Isles. Evidently, the forward-thinking and open acceptance of faiths that Catherine Parr championed throughout her life was not shared by the public. Over the next couple of centuries, Parr's grave was continually disturbed. The first disturbance was likely during the English Civil War, as King Charles I used the burial site, Sudeley Castle, as a base, which was sieged. However, accounts detail the coffin being disturbed and ransacked 3 times in the 1780s, all before 1792. A final break-in left Catherine's corpse being thrown on a rubbish heap. Evidently, not all England kept the faith. Buried in marriage before being buried in earth, Catherine of Aragon was the first of Henry VIII's 6 wives. Born into Spanish and Italian aristocracy in 1485, Catherine of Aragon likely never imagined the wholesale institutional mayhem her married life would bring. Though none of Henry's wives had a dignified time marrying the brutal beheading king, Catherine of Aragon arguably got the most stinging of experiences. Catherine was initially married to Henry's older brother Arthur, but he would die just 5 months into their union. This left Catherine somewhat floating and lost in a system of arranged marriages and securing bloodlines. She would accomplish becoming the first female ambassador to a crown in Europe's history in 1507. And 2 years later, she would marry Arthur's younger brother. However, the heart and love show little care for what arranged marriages and royal bloodlines demand. Henry VIII may have been wedded to Catherine of Aragon, but he was soon very much in love with Anne Boleyn. Between a heart being elsewhere and a marriage producing no sons, Henry wanted a divorce, and the Catholic Church said, nah. In a historical turn, Henry would pass parliamentary acts of supremacy to annul his marriage, and as a result, set in motion a conflict between the Catholic Church and the Crown of England. Henry would go on to marry Anne Boleyn the moment the Church of England was separated from Catholicism. Yet, Catherine of Aragon would only be a figure of public support and sympathy. The English population saw how she was dismissed by a king with his head and heart elsewhere, and her relief programs for the poorest of citizens were not forgotten. Catherine's death and burial would only be a sad story. Though she would be given the title of Dowager Princess of Wales and would declare herself the king's only rightful wife, the rest of her days would be in banishment. Confined to royal castles with no access to her own daughter, Mary, and only leaving the premise for Mass, Catherine of Aragon was confined to barely any human contact, but rare visitors and forbidden letters. In a last gasp attempt, she would write to the king pleading to protect her daughter. A year later, Catherine of Aragon would die at Kimbolton Castle in 1536. Later exhumation of Catherine's body would show a black growth on her heart, later understood to be cancer, but claimed at the time to be a mark of poisoning. Henry VIII would not attend her funeral, but perhaps more chillingly, he denied their daughter Mary the right to attend. Anne of Cleves was the mystery of all Henry VIII's wives. Little was seemingly known about her, and the marriage itself lasted only 6 months. Born Anne von Cleve in 1515, the young German would be a pawn in greater politics in her adult life. Her marriage to Henry VIII was only entirely born of political circumstance. Anne of Cleves was married so Henry could align himself with her brother. William of Jülich-Cleves-Burge led Western Germany's Protestant population and was similarly wary of France and the Holy Roman Empire's Catholic bent. After nearly 10 months of negotiations, Henry would marry Anne on the 6th of January 1540. Remarkably, there really isn't a huge amount of detail noted about this royal union. The picture we do have is Henry once again using marriage for his own ends, and the results weren't outstanding. Henry felt he'd been falsely advertised on Anne's appearance, and the consummation, if you will, was not a success. Henry's post-wedding night review was not laced with charm, stating he had liked her before not well, but now liked her much worse. What a guy! The only real charm in this tasteless marriage of political convenience is the warmth and innocence that Anne of Cleves projected throughout. When asked about the marriage by Countess of Rutland, Anne gave a simple riposte. She declared the king kissed her good morning and good night every day, declaring her sweetheart and darling. Lady Rutland would reply that kindness was well and good, but producing a Duke of York was of much more importance. After 6 months, the marriage would be annulled with no protest from Anne, which is where the story really begins. Evidently, Anne's soul and person weren't lost on him. Following the annulment, Henry declared her the king's beloved sister. She was the favorite woman in England to Henry, bar his wife and daughters. Reportedly, the two became close friends, and her settlement left her several royal properties. Remembered as a generous and courteous figure to all who served her, Anne of Cleves would pass away on the 16th of July in 1557. She had outlived both Henry VIII and his remaining wives, though most interestingly, her import and vaunted position in the eyes of the Tudor house was immortalized in her burial. No mention of politics or annulment. She was buried in Westminster Abbey with a clear epitaph: Anne of Cleves, Queen of England. The only child of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon, Queen Mary I, was born into the Tudor dynasty, but would indelibly create her own. Most famously, her reign would be a mammoth attempt to reverse an entire stanchion of her father's reign, the English Reformation. Across her reign, nearly 300 people would be burnt at the stake for religious dissent, and lo and behold, the term Bloody Mary was born. It may not have helped Mary that her supposed rival to the throne, Lady Jane Grey, was deposed and beheaded by forces assembled by Mary. As you can imagine, a monarch who entirely upends the country's church, much like her father, makes a lot of enemies. Her religious policy would force over 800 Protestants into exile and make many martyrs of those burnt alive. When Queen Mary would die, her tyrannical policies against Protestants would only bring anti-Catholic and anti-Spanish sentiment alive in England. Queen Mary I's burial marked an awkward crossroads for the English crown. Elizabeth I would be her successor and a force for bridging religious divide. She wanted to respect her predecessor, but maybe not too much, mind you. Queen Mary I was buried on December 14, 1558, around a month after her passing. Her will demanded her mother, Catherine of Aragon, be exhumed, so they would be buried together. This request was denied, and Mary was buried alone at Westminster Abbey. While afforded a grand Tudor burial ceremony that would cost many millions in today's money, her grave stood unmarked for half a century, and her tomb was disturbed on several occasions. Finally, upon Elizabeth I's death, her tomb was placed underneath her sister's. Wow, humiliation even after death. If you're looking for perhaps the worst royal burial of all time, please look no further than Catherine of Valois, the Queen of England from 1420 to 1422. Her marriage to Henry V was another royal political effort to avert war and enmity. Catherine of Valois was wed to end the 100 Years' War between England and France. Unfortunately, not all 100 years were quite up yet. It didn't work so much. In fairness to Catherine, when King Henry V would die 2 years after their marriage, she did remarry Owen Tudor, bearing no less than 6 children and bringing us the Tudor dynasty. In a tragic turn, despite a marriage without toil and deception, having done nothing wrong in the eyes of the crown, Catherine's burial became a literal spectacle. Following her death in January 1437, Catherine would be buried, like all honored English royalty, at Westminster Abbey. Yet the service and procession changed things somewhat. When her coffin was placed in her tomb, the lid to her coffin was raised by accident, and rather than rectify this, it just became a tourist attraction. Some 200 years later, writers including Samuel Pepys would write how they would visit Westminster Abbey and see the corpse of Queen Catherine of Valois. Nobody closed the lid, and it just kept attracting the masses, and would be nearly 400 years later under the reign of Queen Victoria before she was properly buried. What can you say? Fake marriages with glorious burials and fine marriages with terrible ones. Oh, those monarchs. This is History on Fleek, and we'll see you next time.